Are you nervous?
Shut up, Alex.
I was just asking. I'd be nervous if I were you.
Sweaty palms, jelly legs, nervous jitters. We've all been there.
I still remember every single detail of that 35 minutes.
A driver's licence is a pass to freedom, but it comes at a cost. And in New Zealand, it's a hefty and lengthy one.
Right now, going from no licence to a full licence is a 3-stage process. First up, the theory test to get your learners, which you can get once you're 16 and costs $96.10. Now, after 6 months on your learners, you can then sit your first practical to get a restricted licence. This costs $167.50. Then comes time for the final round, and that's another practical at a cost of $98.98, and that's to get your full licence. So all of that brings us to a total of $362.50. That's not exactly cheap.
Not cheap at all. But that could be about to change.
The government wants to remove the second practical driving test needed to get a full licence.
It's designed to make it easier for people to graduate from a restricted to a full licence, designed to make the system a bit more efficient.
It's the biggest shake-up to the rules in over a decade. But with almost 40% of people failing their full licence test the first time around, is scrapping it really a good idea?
I would expect that somebody on a driving test would be on their best behaviour. So if 39% of people are failing on their best behaviour, what are those people like when they're driving without supervision, without being on a test?
Kia ora, I'm Davina Zimmer, and on The Detail today, the pushback to the proposed changes for getting a driver's licence.
We really want to see more of a focus on let's actually try and lift the standard and quality of our driving in New Zealand. Let's not just try and not make road safety any worse, let's try and make it better.
And whether those in charge of giving learner drivers the tick of approval think the changes go far enough.
No, I don't believe they do. There's little to no emphasis on training.
Mark Revel-Johnson is the president of the New Zealand Institute of Driver Educators. We'll hear more from him later in the episode. First, though, New Zealand has one of the worst youth road safety records in the developed world. In 2023, young drivers were responsible for 75 fatal crashes. Almost 90 people under the age of 25 died, and more than 600 youth were seriously injured. Dylan Thompson, AA's road safety spokesperson, says a major contributing factor is our licensing system. Despite the fact that we have 2 practical tests while many other countries only have 1, we have far less emphasis on preparation and training. So, while losing the second practical test may take away some stress and provide some relief on the wallet, he worries about what it will do for road safety.
We did some research at the AA Research Foundation last year, and we looked at New Zealand compared to other similar countries, Australian states, US states, a number of European countries. And we are a big outlier in terms of it actually being quicker and easier to get a driver's licence than any other country around the world. Currently in New Zealand, you do a theory test in front of a computer for getting your learner's licence, and then you have an on-road driving test to gain your restricted licence, and then after 12 or 18 months, you can then go for your full licence and do a second on-road driving test.
The government wants to make it easier for people to get their full driver's licence. We know how important that is for so many New Zealanders. The major change we're proposing is getting rid of the requirement for a second practical test when you get your full driver's licence.
New Zealand is actually quite unusual. When we look at similar countries, most other countries only have 1 on-road driving test. And so the government has said, we're going to look at changing so we'll be the same as other countries, and there will just be the 1 on-road test to get your restricted licence, and then there won't be another driving test to go on to the full licence. So that's the most significant change. And then there's a few others. One is that they're looking at reducing the demerit point threshold. It's currently 100, and bringing that down to 50 demerit points for people on a learner's or restricted licence. Essentially what that means is you would have to commit less offences to reach that 50-point threshold, and that would mean that then you would have a 3-month suspension. And also introducing a 0 alcohol limit, when you're on a learner or restricted licence. And again, that change is something that would bring us in line with a lot of other countries where you just say until people get their full licence, regardless of their age, it's a zero alcohol limit.
There are a couple of other changes, like reducing the number of vision tests and introducing a clean driving record mandate.
When you're on your restricted licence, you would have to wait at least 12 months before you would automatically progress to a full licence. If you were on that restricted licence and you committed any type of driving offence, so that could be a speeding ticket, driving without a seatbelt, it could be breaching your licence conditions and driving at night or carrying passengers, just any offence, the clock restarted on that 12-month period. So maybe you had done 11 months as restricted licence and you were 1 month away from progressing to your full licence, and then you were caught. You would go back and have to start that 12-month period again before you would go on to that full licence. The vision test, at the moment, every time you renew your licence, every 10 years, you have to do an eyesight test. And what the government's proposing is you would do one test when you went for your learner licence, and then you wouldn't need to do another one until the age of 45, and then again not until the age of 75. So quite a big reduction in the amount of vision tests.
Chris Bishop says he wants to make the process of getting a driver's licence more affordable and efficient. And there is a focus on safety as well, in the zero alcohol limit, and tougher consequences for those on their learners or restricted racking up too many demerit points. But in AA's opinion, it's not enough. Dylan says we should be focusing on making roads safer.
We actually have one of the worst rates of road deaths of any developed country in the world, and our 15 to 25-year-olds have the highest crash rate of any age group in New Zealand. So what we wanted to see change, or what we've been saying to the government, is let's extend our learner period from 6 months to 12 months, so people actually have a longer period under supervision to build up their driving skills. And also, all the other countries we looked at have requirements for a minimum number of hours of supervised practice that you have to do. So we think New Zealand should follow suit, and we would like the government to say, as a learner, you need to clock up at least 60 hours of supervised practice before you can go and sit your restricted test. And we think that as many people as possible in New Zealand, when they're learning to drive, should be using professional training, because it's a completely different experience to learning with your mum or dad. So we would really like the government to bring in some incentives. So with those 60 hours of supervised practice, if you did an hour with a professional trainer, that would actually count for 2 or 3 times the hours in terms of you getting towards that target of 60. With the research we've done, when you look at it, countries that have introduced this have seen between a 10 to 20% reduction in crashes amongst young drivers after these types of measures have been brought in.
So how would those hours be tracked?
Most of the countries that we've looked at use an app on the phone, and the way it works is generally they get into the car, they push a button that says, I'm about to start doing a practice drive, and that will then send a message to whoever they have said is their supervising driver. And so that other person will get a message come through on their phone saying, this driver says that you are taking them out on a practice drive at the moment. Is that true? And you respond, yes. And then from that point, it's kind of like any of the map apps that we use. So it can tell when you're in motion in a vehicle, and it'll just record however long that drive goes for until you stop it at the end.
There is a possibility that this approach could drive up demand for instructors, risking leaving yet another workforce overworked and under-resourced. But Dylan says the majority of the hours would be clocked up by driving with mum or dad.
It's not 60 hours of professional training, it's 60 hours of supervised practice. So we're not advocating for any mandatory, compulsory, you have to have professional training. But we would like to see more people using it. The AA obviously has the biggest driving school in the country. I think we could handle more people coming in and getting professional training. But if we did see a big upsurge in young New Zealanders looking to have more lessons, it would probably be something where we would have to look at having more instructors depending on the demand.
Dylan says the opportunity to change the driver's licensing system doesn't come around often, so it's important to take full advantage when it does.
So back around 2011, 2012 was the last time that this happened. And that was when the minimum learner age went from 15 to 16. And also the restricted test got made a bit tougher, a bit longer and more standardised around the country. Generally speaking, it's probably at least 10 or 15 years will be the gap before we look at making any changes to the driver licensing system. And that's why it's important that we take this opportunity right now to actually make some more significant and beneficial changes, because probably going to be a while before we look at doing any more again.
Why is there such a long gap in between these reviews?
I think that's just the reality, really, of government and the way our systems work. There's only so many different issues that the government of the day can work through and look at. These things have to go through quite a rigorous policy process in lots of cases. You've got staff at the Ministry of Transport who need to do policy analysis work and put papers together and, look at research, evaluations overseas, those kind of things. And so once the driver licensing system has been looked at and some changes have been made, it kind of drops to the back of the queue, I guess. Every government will have certain priorities and certain things that they want to look at changing and progressing in transport, and just like in all other areas. And so they will focus on the key things that they're wanting to progress. And there is just a limited bandwidth of the things that can be worked on and done in a 3-year political term.
What has government's response been to AA wanting to take the changes further?
We've had meetings with staff from the Minister of Transport's office, with officials from the Ministry of Transport. We've talked about this with MPs from all the political parties, both in government and in opposition, because we've really wanted to make the strongest case we can for saying we've got an opportunity here to actually raise the bar. There's strong evidence that shows if we do this, we're going to see less crashes and less young people killed and hurt. The government has definitely been very open to listening to us, and now they need to make their final decisions.
How would you rank the competence of New Zealand drivers on the world scale?
That's a good one. I don't think we're much better or worse than anywhere else. You can go and find bad drivers in any place in the world. I can even pin that down to towns in New Zealand. I've worked in several towns, and everybody says, the people in this town are dreadful drivers, or the people in this town can't signal at roundabouts. It is absolutely common across the country, believe me.
That's Mark Revell-Johnson, who's the president of the New Zealand Institute of Driver Educators, giving a very diplomatic answer to my rather targeted question. He's been an instructor here for about 2 decades and doesn't think getting rid of the final test is a good idea.
If you look at the statistics, there's about 39% of people are failing the full licence test when they take it. Now, if you look at that from an instructor's point of view, I would expect that somebody on a driving test would be on their best behaviour. So if 39% of people are failing on their best behaviour, what are those people like when they're driving without supervision, without being on a test? And when you looked at the reasons for people failing, it was things that the police are telling us are the causes of serious injury and fatal crashes. So things like speeding, failing to give way, not observing stop signs or traffic lights correctly. So they're risky behaviours, and if you're doing those sorts of behaviours on a driving test, you've got to wonder what somebody's doing when they're not on a test. Mm. Those that weren't opposed to it, they look to the overseas jurisdictions who also have graduated licensing, and there isn't an exit test in a lot of those jurisdictions. But those places that don't have an exit test do have some really robust safety measures for that restricted period and across the whole licensing period in general. So things like a minimum number of supervised practice hours before you are allowed to go for either of the tests. There are things like having to do a computer-based hazard perception test, which has been used now quite widely around the world, and it indicates where people aren't good at perceiving potential hazards. We certainly find that a lot of drivers are fairly good at spotting actual hazards. It's the prediction and the perception of something that might go wrong is where drivers often fall down.
The idea of having a mandatory number of hours people on their learners or restricted have to complete before moving on to the next stage was also proposed by AA and is something already implemented in many other comparable countries.
Actually being in the vehicle and doing it is probably one of the best ways to pick up experience. And that should always be supervised in those early days, because the one thing that the novice driver lacks is the experience to be able to see when something's about to go wrong. A lot of the places that require a minimum number of hours, and it does vary quite widely, but what they do is credit 1 hour with mum and dad with 1 hour. But if you do it with a professional instructor, that 1 hour would count for 3 hours of your 120 or your 50 or your 60 or whatever it is, which in turn then encourages people to use the professionals.
Do you think it's better to learn from a professional instructor than it is from mum and dad?
Both have their place. So the professional can pick up some of the finer details and some of the techniques that will cause problems or some of the lacking skills. But actually, time behind the wheel driving is important. And I don't think I would be naive enough to suggest that people would pay for 120 hours of lessons with a driving instructor. It's time behind the wheel that counts. So time with mum and dad is also vital, but time with a professional is extremely valuable. We pick up things that parents sometimes don't. So, for example, we will often see somebody who thinks they're ready for a driving test. They'll arrive at an intersection and they'll ask the supervisor whether they should go or not. And in that case, the supervisor is making the decision, not the driver. So that driver, to me, is not ready to go and do a driving test, and they're not ready for independent driving. The other thing about that is if you look at the serious crashes that happen on the road, the vast majority of those serious crashes are just normal everyday people doing normal everyday things who make a little mistake. Those are the people who are teaching the next generation of drivers. So if they're the ones that cause the serious crashes, then there's something that's going to be missed there. On
the note of crashes, do you think that these changes go far enough in targeting that problem?
No, I don't believe they do. There's little to no emphasis on training. If over the 12-month period between, or 18-month period between gaining a restricted license and being allowed to drive with no restrictions, if you take that full license practical test away, how would we know that somebody is driving? They may have gone overseas and used public transport for a year. How would we know that they're practicing the right things and doing the right things in the car and becoming an experienced, safe driver? If you put some structured training into that process, and yes, there's certainly the element of cost in there for people, but if you put that over that 12 to 18-month period, that spreads the costs across. But let's make sure our people who, before they go out with no restrictions on their driving license, let's make sure that they can drive in a motorway situation. Let's make sure they can drive on a rural high-speed road. Make sure that they can drive at night. Make sure they can drive in bad weather conditions and in town situations. So if you put a structured modular program in there, then we could be a little more confident that we're preparing people properly for fully independent driving.
Because Mark says the most common mistakes are the simple things that only time and practice can teach.
Judgments of whether to go or not at an intersection. So what does a safe gap look like? We'll often see people who can pick a safe gap in a 50k zone, but then struggle to adapt their perceptions to the higher speeds when they get onto open roads. Not looking far enough ahead or not looking wide. So scanning roadsides and driveways as well as what's directly in front. And certainly the lack of appreciation of what's going on behind them is a big problem. I mean, I'm sure we've all seen or encountered or heard of a situation where a car stops for something that's happening in front of them, but the car behind doesn't.
How do we, because there will be people listening to this, listening to your idea of having a module where people potentially have to tick off, having driven in wet weather, having driven on a motorway, and they'll say, oh, that sounds like there's going to be a lot of extra cost and there's going to be a lot of extra admin of organising where to drive. What would your response to that be?
I absolutely accept that, and it's certainly a problem that we have given the nature of the country. But the simple response is, what value do you put on your kid's life? Are we going to send them out unprepared, or are we going to send them out as well prepared as we possibly can? And that's what it is. I mean, the families across the country are affected by road trauma every single day, and a lot of it is so unnecessary.
That's all for today from The Detail, a newsroom production that's supported by RNZ and NZ On Air. This episode was produced by Gwen McClure and engineered by Rangi Poick. Thank you to Dylan Thompson and Mark Revel Johnson for joining me in this episode. I'm Davina Zimmer, ka kite.